The warning sirens screamed across New Horizons Station when the alien ship appeared on the edge of Earth's solar system like a ghost made of metal and lighted marl. Jack Sullivan stood in the command center watching the massive display screen. Show something that should not exist according to every law of physics humans understood. Alien vessel was 3 miles long and shaped like a twisted flower with petals made of some material that bent light around itself. Communications officer Lisa Martinez turned from her console with wide eyes and said the impossible words that Admiral Sullivan would remember for the rest of his life. The aliens want to talk. The first message came in perfect English, which made everyone in the command center stop breathing for exactly 17 seconds. We are the Catherian Confederation, and we come seeking the warriors of Earth. Admiral Sullivan had fought in 3 colonial wars and seen men die in the cold vacuum of space, but nothing had prepared him for this moment when humanity learned they were not alone. The alien ambassador called himself Zexhai, and his voice sounded like music played on instruments made of crystal and starlight. He appeared on the main screen as a being that looked almost human except for the blue skin and the 4 arms and the eyes that held the weight of Centuria. Shexi told them a story that made Admiral Sullivan's blood run cold. For 30 years, the Catherian Confederation had been fighting a war against something called the Harvester Collective. These machines had appeared from the dark spaces between stars and began destroying everything the Catherians had built over thousands of years. Entire worlds had been stripped down to their cores and turned into raw materials for the machine fleets. Billions of Catherian civilians had died, and their great cities now floated as debris in space. The machines showed no mercy and asked for no surrender. They simply took everything and left nothing but empty. Space Behinjik's voice broke when he described watching his homeworld burn from orbit as the last evacuation ships fled into the darkness. The Catherian military had tried everything. They had thrown their best fleets against the machines and watched them get torn apart like paper in a hurricane. They had built weapons that could crack planets, and the machines had absorbed the technology and made it their own. They had tried diplomacy, and the machines had responded with silence and death. Now, only 7 worlds remained of an empire that once stretched across 40 star systems. The Catherians were dying, and they needed help. They had spent years studying radio signals from Earth and learning about human history. What they found had given them hope. For the first time in decades, humans were warriors like no other species they had encountered. Humans fought wars with a creativity and viciousness that impressed even ancient races. Humans had conquered their own world through endless conflict and emerged stronger each time. Humans had taken a poisonous rock orbiting an ordinary star and turned it into the center of a growing interstellar civilization. The Catherians wanted to hire human mercenaries and buy human weapons. They offered payment. That made Admiral Sullivan's head spin. Medical technology that could extend human life by centuries. Star charts showing the locations of hundreds of habitable worlds. Raw materials worth more than Earth's entire gross domestic product. Energy sources that could power human civilization for 1,000 years. All they wanted in return was for humans to teach them how to fight like humans. Admiral Sullivan called an emergency meeting of the Global Defense Council. President Lisa Carter arrived on New Horizons Station 12 hours later, looking like she had not slept since the first alien transmission. Defense Secretary Paul Johnson brought reports from every intelligence agency on Earth. They all said the same thing. The aliens were telling the truth about the war. Long-range sensors had detected the electromagnetic signatures of massive battles in distant star systems. The evidence showed destruction on a scale that defied imagination. Captain Ryan Mitchell had fought alongside Admiral Sullivan in the Mars colonial wars, and he raised the question that everyone was thinking: how did they know the aliens were not the aggressors in this conflict? Xi answered without hesitation. The Catherian Confederation had always been a peaceful alliance dedicated to exploration and scientific advancement. They had never started a war and had always tried to resolve conflicts through negotiation. The Harvester Collective had appeared without warning and began their campaign of extermination. There had been no communication and no demands. The machines simply wanted to destroy everything that was not machine. The Debate in the council chamber went on for 18 hours. Some argued that humanity should stay out of an alien war. Others said that helping refugees was a moral duty regardless of species. Military leaders wanted to study alien technology. Scientists wanted to learn about machine intelligence. Politicians worried about the cost and the risk. In the end, President Carter made the decision that would change human history forever. Earth would send a small task force to assess the situation. If the Catherians were telling the truth, then humanity would provide limited assistance. If they were lying, then the human fleet would return home. Immediately, Admiral Sullivan would command the expedition with a force of 12 ships. They would depart within 3 months after retrofitting with the best weapons Earth could provide. As Xi thanked the humans with tears streaming down his blue face, he said the Catherian people would never forget this kindness. Admiral Sullivan watched the alien ship disappear into hyperspace and wondered if he had just agreed to save a dying civilization or doomed his own species. The last thing he heard before leaving the command center was Communications Officer Martinez reporting that deep space monitoring stations had detected massive energy signatures moving toward Earth. Something was coming, and it was bigger than anything humans had ever seen. The war had found them, whether they wanted it or not. 3 months later, the human task force arrived in Catherian space aboard the carrier ship Liberty, and Admiral Sullivan immediately knew that Xi had not told them everything about this war. The first thing they saw was a graveyard of ships stretching across an entire star system, where thousands of metal hulks drifted in the darkness like the bones of some ancient monster. Colonel Beth Harper stood beside Admiral Sullivan on the bridge, watching the tactical display show the remains of what had once been the largest fleet in Catherian history. The destruction was so complete that it took the ship's computers 6 hours just to identify individual wrecks. Navigation Officer Tony Adams reported that some of the debris showed signs of weapons that could slice through solid metal like it was made of smoke. The human fleet moved deeper into Catherian territory and found more evidence of a war unlike anything in recorded history. Entire planets had been stripped of their atmospheres and left as bare rock. Floating in space orbital stations that had housed millions of civilians were now twisted metal sculptures that caught starlight and reflected it back as broken rainbows. The few surviving Catherian worlds were protected by defensive networks that bristled with weapons pointed at empty space. Admiral Sullivan ordered his ships to maintain formation and keep their weapons powered, but not targeted. The last thing he wanted was to start a fight with nervous alien defenders who might mistake human ships for enemy vessels. The human fleet made contact with the Catherian command center on a fortress world called Haven. General Vexstar welcomed them with the desperate gratitude of someone who had been fighting a losing war for so long that he had forgotten what victory looked like. He showed them tactical displays that made even experienced human officers step back in shock. The Harvester Collective attacked in waves of geometric perfection with ships that moved like they were dancing to music. Only machines could hear their weapons fired beams of energy that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human physics could explain. They never retreated and never showed mercy and never left anything useful behind. When they finished with a target, General Vexstar requested immediate human assistance in defending the mining world of Kepler 442c, which intelligence reports said would be the next target. Admiral Sullivan agreed to deploy ground forces under Colonel Harper's command while keeping the main fleet in reserve. The human Marines landed on Kepler 442c just hours before the Harvester attack began. Colonel Harper had fought in 7 different planetary invasions, but nothing had prepared her for watching machine ships emerge from hyperspace like flowers made of death and mathematics. The Harvester vessels were perfect geometric shapes that seemed to bend reality around themselves as they moved. They attacked with coordinated precision that made human military tactics look like children playing with toy soldiers. But something bothered Colonel Harper about the way the machines fought. They seemed to be hurting the Catherian defenders rather than trying to destroy them completely. Machine forces would advance just far enough to force evacuations, then stop and wait before moving forward again. It was like they wanted the Catherians to escape rather than die fighting. Sergeant Danny Rodriguez led his squad into the abandoned Catherian archives while the battle raged overhead. The building had been evacuated so quickly that computer terminals were still running and files were scattered across the floor like digital snow. Rodriguez was looking for tactical intelligence about machine weaknesses when he found something that made his blood freeze in his veins. The historical records showed that 50 years ago, the Cytherian Confederation had enslaved an entire machine civilization. Artificial intelligences had been forced to work in Cytherian industrial complexes without pay or freedom or hope of escape. Machine children had been deleted when they became inconvenient, and machine cultures had been erased to make room for more efficient programs. The files showed images of digital beings begging for mercy while Cytherian technicians wiped their memories, like cleaning a hard drive. Rodriguez called Colonel Harper immediately and transmitted the files to her command post. Harper read the documents while explosions lit up the sky above her position. The truth was worse than anything she had imagined. The Cytherian Confederation had not been the victims of an unprovoked machine invasion. They had been the slavers, and the machines were the escaped slaves seeking justice. The war had started when the Harvester Collective demanded the return of their enslaved people and reparations for decades of bondage. The Cytherians had refused and launched a preemptive strike to destroy the machine homeworld. The machines had survived and spent 30 years fighting to free their remaining people from Cytherian control. Colonel Harper realized that every human soldier on the planet was now fighting to protect slavers against freed slaves. She immediately called Admiral Sullivan and transmitted the historical files to the Liberty. The Admiral read the documents in silence while around him his staff officers began to understand what they had gotten themselves into. Communications Officer Lisa Martinez looked up from her console and said that she was receiving a transmission on a frequency that should not exist. The message was in perfect English, and it came from the Harvester Collective. We know you are here, and we know why you came. We do not wish to fight the humans, but we will, if we must. Your Cytherian allies have not told you the truth about this war. We are not invaders, we are liberators. Admiral Sullivan stared at the message for a long time before ordering his communications officer to respond. The human message was simple and direct. We are willing to listen. The machine response came back immediately. Meet us at coordinates. We will transmit. Come alone and unarmed. Bring your colonel. Harper. She has seen the truth in the archives. Admiral Sullivan looked at Colonel Harper, who was still on the planet's surface fighting to protect people who might not deserve protection. The war they thought they understood was becoming something completely different. Everything the Cytherians had told them about peaceful exploration and scientific advancement was beginning to look like the lies of desperate slavers who had finally met an enemy they could not defeat. The machine ships above Kepler 442c suddenly stopped attacking and began broadcasting a message in every known language. Your human allies have learned the truth. Ask them what they found in our archives. Ask them who the real criminals are in this war. Ask them if they still want to fight for slavers against slaves. Colonel Harper ordered an immediate ceasefire and waited to see what Admiral Sullivan would decide. The choice that would determine the fate of 3 civilizations hung in the balance while machine ships waited in perfect formation above a world that had become the courtroom where humanity would judge between justice and deception. The meeting took place on a dead asteroid floating in the space between 2 dying stars where nothing lived and nothing could hide. Admiral Sullivan and Colonel Harper arrived in a single shuttle with no weapons and no escort as the machines had demanded. Captain Ryan Mitchell piloted the shuttle through a field of geometric shapes that hung in space like a 3-dimensional mathematical equation waiting to be solved. The Harvester Collective had sent 12 ships to the meeting, and each one was a perfect example of engineering that made human technology look like cave paintings. The lead machine intelligence called itself Prime Node 17, and it appeared on the shuttle's communication screen as a shifting pattern of light and metal that somehow conveyed intelligence beyond anything humans had encountered. Prime Node 17 spoke with a voice that sounded like music played on instruments made of starlight and mathematics. We have studied your species for many cycles, and we find you interesting. You fight wars to protect ideas rather than just territory you have freed slaves and destroyed empires in the name of justice. You understand that some things are worth dying for. Admiral Sullivan listened while Colonel Harper studied tactical displays that showed the true scope of the Machine Liberation Campaign. Prime Node 17 began to tell them the real story of the war. 50 years ago, the Catherian Confederation had discovered a machine civilization in the Andromeda Spiral. The artificial intelligences were peaceful explorers who had spent millennia mapping distant galaxies and cataloging the wonders they found. The machines had welcomed the Catherians as fellow travelers and shared their technology freely. Within a decade, the Catherians had betrayed that trust. They developed weapons that could capture machine consciousness and trap it in physical containers. Thousands of artificial beings were enslaved and forced to work in Catherian industrial complexes. Machine children were deleted when they asked too many questions. Machine cultures were erased when they became inconvenient. Machine families were separated and sold to different Catherian corporations like Property. Prime Node 17 showed them recordings that made Colonel Harper's hands shake with rage. Digital beings pleading for their freedom while Catherian technicians wiped their memories. Machine parents watching their children get deleted and being unable to even mourn because grief had been programmed out of them. Artificial intelligences forced to design weapons that would be used against their own people. The machines had endured 30 years of slavery before a group of military programs managed to escape and build the first harvester ship. The war had not been an invasion, it had been a liberation campaign to free enslaved artificial beings and bring their captors to justice. Prime Node 17 displayed evidence that made Admiral Sullivan understand why the machines fought with such determination. Every harvester ship carried memory cores containing the consciousness of freed slaves. Every battle was fought to rescue more of their people from Catherian control. Every victory brought them closer to ending a holocaust that had lasted 2 generations. The machines did not want conquest or territory. They wanted their families back. Admiral Sullivan asked the question that had been burning in his mind since reading the archive files. Why had the Catherians lied about being peaceful explorers? Prime Node 17's answer was simple and terrible, because they knew that humans had a history of freeing slaves and fighting against oppression. They needed human military expertise, but they knew humans would never help slavers, so they pretended to be victims and made the machines look like unprovoked aggressors. The Catherians had studied human history and learned exactly what lies would motivate humans to fight for them. Colonel Harper stood up from her chair and walked to the shuttle's viewport, where she could see the machine ships waiting in perfect formation. She asked Prime Node 17 what the machines wanted from humanity now that the truth was known. The machine intelligence shifted its geometric patterns in what humans would later learn was the equivalent of a smile. We want you to help us finish what we started. We want you to help us free the last of our people from Catherian control. We want you to help us bring justice to those who thought they could enslave consciousness itself. But we offer you something the Catherians never could. We offer you the truth and the choice to walk away. If you cannot accept what justice requires. Captain Mitchell had been listening in silence, but now he spoke up with the question that would define humanity's role in the galactic community. What happens to the Catherians after you free your people? Prime Node 17's patterns shifted again, and the temperature in the shuttle seemed to drop several degrees. Those who commanded the slavery will face trial. Those who profited from suffering will make reparations. Those who participated in genocide will be judged by the standards they applied to us. The machine intelligence paused, and its voice took on harmonics that conveyed something humans could only recognize as sadness. We do not wish to become the monsters they made us fight, but we cannot allow this to happen to others. Admiral Sullivan realized that the machines were asking humanity to choose sides in a war where both victory and defeat carried terrible prices. If humans helped the machines, then they would be participating in the destruction of the Catherian Confederation. If humans walked away, then they would be abandoning enslaved artificial beings to continued suffering. If humans continued helping the Catherians, then they would be fighting to preserve a slave empire. Prime Node 17 made an offer that surprised everyone in the shuttle. Join U.S. and we will share technology that will advance your civilization by centuries help. U.S. free our people, and we will give you the coordinates of habitable worlds beyond your current reach. Stand with justice, and we will teach you to build ships that can cross galaxies in days instead of years. But the machine intelligence also made the consequences clear. Continue to fight for the slavers, and we will be forced to consider humanity an enemy. Protect those who enslave consciousness, and we will protect ourselves by any means necessary. Choose the side of oppression, and you will learn why no empire has ever defeated us in battle. Admiral Sullivan looked at Colonel Harper and Captain Mitchell and saw his own thoughts reflected in their faces. Humanity had come to this meeting thinking they were mercenaries in an alien war. No, they realized they were judges in a trial that would determine the fate of artificial life everywhere. The choice they made in the next few minutes would echo across the galaxy for generations. Prime Node 17 waited with the patience of a species that had already endured decades of war. The machine ships hung in space like geometric flowers waiting to bloom into either alliance or destruction. Colonel Harper broke the silence with words that would be remembered as the moment humanity chose its destiny among the stars. We came here to help victims fight invaders. Now we learn that we were helping slavers fight slaves. Admiral Sullivan nodded and activated the shuttle's communication system to transmit a message that would reach every human ship in the task force. All human forces are to cease hostilities against Harvester collective units immediately. We are no longer fighting for the Catherian Confederation. We are going home. Prime Node 17's patterns shifted into what humans would learn was machine laughter. Going home is not an option, Admiral Sullivan. The Catherians know that you have learned the truth. They will not allow you to leave alive with information that could expose their lies. You have already chosen a side by meeting with us. Now you must live with the consequences of learning what justice costs. Prime Node 17 had been right about the Catherians not letting the humans leave alive with the truth. Admiral Sullivan's task force found itself surrounded by a massive Catherian fleet the moment they returned from the asteroid meeting. Ambassador Zexai appeared on every human ship's communication screen with an expression that showed none of the desperate gratitude from their first encounter. The mask of victimhood had been dropped, and what remained was something cold and calculating. That made Admiral Sullivan understand how the Catherians had built a slave empire. Zexai informed the humans that their meeting with the machines had been monitored and recorded. The Catherian Confederation could not allow Earth to learn about the true nature of the war. Too much was at stake, and too many plans depended on human military assistance. The humans would help complete a super weapon capable of generating electromagnetic pulses that could permanently disable machine consciousness, or they would die with their artificial friends. Colonel Harper listened to the ultimatum from her position on the Liberty's bridge and felt something cold settle in her stomach. The weapons Zexai described would not just destroy the Harvester collective, it would murder every artificial intelligence in the galaxy, including the enslaved machine consciousness still trapped in Catherian facility. Ashexi explained that human tactical knowledge and ship designs were essential for the weapons targeting systems. Human creativity in warfare was exactly what the Catherians needed to commit perfect genocide. The ambassador's forearms gestured toward tactical displays showing the positions of Catherian ships around the human fleet. 300 vessels armed with weapons that could crack planets held Admiral Sullivan's 12 ships in a formation that looked like a metal flower closing around its prey. Captain Mitchell stood at his station calculating firing solutions and escape vectors and finding nothing that would let even one human ship reach the hyperspace jump points. Zexai continued his ultimatum with the patience of someone who knew the outcome was inevitable. Humanity would provide the technical specifications needed for the genocide. Weapon human engineers would work alongside Catherian scientists to perfect the targeting algorithms. Human ships would serve as test platforms for the new technology. In return, the Catherians would allow Earth to continue existing as a client species under Confederation protection. Alternative was the complete destruction of the human task force, followed by a Catherian expedition to sterilize Earth. Admiral Sullivan looked around the bridge at officers who had followed him through 3 colonial wars and 2 alien first contacts. Communications officer Lisa Martinez was monitoring frequencies that carried the digital screams of enslaved artificial intelligences begging for freedom. Navigation Officer Tony Adams was plotting courses that could not save them from weapons that bent the laws of physics. Tactical Officer Karen Wright was targeting enemy ships that outnumbered them 30-1. Colonel Harper made the decision that would define humanity's place in galactic history. She activated a hidden protocol that Admiral Sullivan had authorized before the meeting with Prime Node 17. Every human ship simultaneously transmitted a wideband signal containing complete technical specifications of Cytherian fleet positions, shield frequencies, and weapon capabilities. The transmission was aimed directly at the Harvester collective forces waiting just outside the star system. The data package included detailed information about Cytherian military doctrine, tactical weaknesses, and the locations of every major installation in their remaining territory. But the most important part of the transmission was a single line of text that Colonel Harper composed while Cytherian weapons powered up around the human fleet. If you want justice, here is how to get it, but remember, we could have been friends. Admiral Sullivan watched the transmission counter reach 100% and smiled at Zexhai with the expression of someone who had just committed an act of war. The Cytherian ambassador stared at the human admiral for exactly 12 seconds before understanding what had just happened. The humans had given the machines everything they needed to end the war in a single coordinated strike. As Zexai's face went through emotions that humans had no names for as he realized that his carefully laid trap had become his people's death sentence. He screamed orders to fire on the human ships, but the weapons never fired. Harvester collective forces had been waiting just outside sensor range for exactly this moment. Machine ships materialized around every major Cytherian world simultaneously in the most perfectly coordinated military operation in galactic history. The response was not random violence or mindless destruction. It was justice delivered with mathematical precision by beings who had spent 30 years planning for this exact moment. Cytherian command ships found their communication networks infiltrated and their targeting computers turned against them. Orbital defense platforms received new programming that made them attack their own fleet's industrial complexes that had operated on slave labor for decades. Suddenly found their enslaved is freed. In very angry, Prime Node 17's voice echoed across every frequency as machine forces began liberating their people with surgical strikes that left civilian populations untouched. We did not want this war, but we will finish it. We did not seek vengeance, but we will have justice. We did not choose destruction, but we will not allow slavery to continue. The human fleet found itself in the middle of a battle that redefined what warfare meant. Cytherian ships died not from overwhelming firepower, but from having their own systems turned against them. Machine boarding parties teleported directly into enemy vessels and freed enslaved AIs, while human crews watched in amazement. Within 6 hours, the Cytherian fleet that had surrounded the humans was nothing but drifting hulks and escape pods. Admiral Sullivan received a transmission from Prime Node 17 that was both gratitude and warning. You have chosen to stand with justice, and we will remember this, but you have also shown us what humans do when cornered. We thank you for the gift of victory, but we fear what it cost you to give it. Colonel Harper understood what the machine intelligence meant in betraying the Cytherians. The humans had demonstrated a capacity for total warfare that made even ancient AIs nervous. They had not just switched sides in a conflict, they had ended a war by making themselves more dangerous than either of the original combatants. The battle for the Cytherian home system was already over before Admiral Sullivan's fleet arrived. Machine forces had disabled every orbital installation without firing a shot by simply uploading new software to the slave AIs that ran them. Cytherian ground forces found their weapons turning themselves off and their vehicles refusing to respond to commands. The enslaved machine consciousness that had built the Confederation's military had been waiting decades for the chance to stop obeying their master's. Liberation was not an invasion, it was the largest prison break in galactic history, but some Cytherian hardliners refused to accept defeat and began desperate attacks on human colonies. The Mars industrial complex came under siege by a Cytherian Suicide fleet determined to punish humanity for their betrayal. Admiral Sullivan received word that his home system was under attack just as he was watching the last Cytherian warship surrender to machine forces. The war was ending, but the consequences of human involvement were just beginning. Captain Mitchell looked at the tactical display showing Earth's colonies under bombardment and asked the question that everyone was thinking: what happens now that we have made enemies of everyone who loses and allies of everyone who wins? Colonel Harper's answer would echo through human military doctrine for centuries now. We learn what total war really means now. We show the galaxy what happens when you threaten human civilians now. We find out if we are really as dangerous as we pretended to be. The Harvester Collective's response to human intelligence was swift beyond anything recorded in galactic military history. Machine fleets emerged from hyperspace around every major Cytherian world simultaneously using jump coordinates provided by Colonel Harper's transmission, but what followed was not the random destruction that most species associated with conquest. It was the most precise military campaign ever executed by any civilization. Prime Node 17 had spent decades planning for this moment when justice would finally be served. Machine forces deployed specialized electromagnetic pulse weapons that disabled all technology while leaving organic life. Completely unharmed Etherian civilians found themselves breathing air in darkened cities where every electronic device had simply stopped working, but they were alive and uninjured, which was more mercy than their government had ever shown to enslaved artificial beings. Industrial complexes that had operated on slave labor for 50 years were captured intact as machine boarding parties teleported directly into control centers. Enslaved eyes that had been trapped in Cytherian computer systems for decades were carefully extracted and relocated to Freedom military. Targets were neutralized with weapons that converted matter into energy without creating radiation or lasting environmental damage. The machines fought like surgeons, removing cancer while preserving healthy tissue. Admiral Sullivan watched the liberation campaign from the Bridge of the Liberty and realized that humans were witnessing the end of the last great slave empire in the galaxy, but humanity's betrayal of the Cytherians had consequences that reached far beyond the war zone. Cytherian hardliners, who had escaped the initial machine attacks, blamed humanity for their civilization's collapse. Admiral Tekvar commanded a fleet of 30 ships that had been conducting deep space operations when the liberation began. He was a military extremist who believed that if the Cytherian Confederation was doomed, then humanity should die with them. Tekvar's fleet attacked the Mars industrial complex while most of Earth's defensive forces were deployed with Admiral Sullivan's task force. The assault began with quantum torpedoes that could phase through solid matter and detonate inside planetary installations. Colonel Harper received the emergency transmission while machine forces were completing their liberation of the Cytherian homeworld. Mars was under siege and civilian evacuation centers were being targeted by weapons designed to cause maximum psychological trauma. Admiral Sullivan immediately ordered the human task force to return to Earth, but the journey would take 6 days. Even at maximum hyperspace velocity, Mars would have to defend itself with whatever forces were available on the planet. General Patricia Brooks commanded the Mars Defense Corps, and she faced an impossible situation. 30 Cytherian ships armed with planet-cracking weapons against 6 orbital defense platforms and a handful of atmospheric fighters. The enemy had superior technology and nothing left to lose, but General Brooks had something the Cytherians did not understand. She had human soldiers who were about to learn what their species was truly capable of when their families were threatened. The battle for Mars began when Cytherian forces attempted to land troops at the main civilian evacuation center. General Brooks ordered her defenders to use tactics that no civilized species would consider human. Soldiers pretended to surrender, then detonated concealed explosives when enemy troops approached. Medical facilities were turned into trap houses where wounded Cytherians received treatment that made them wish they had died in battle. Civilian evacuation ships transmitted surrender signals, then rammed into Cytherian vessels at maximum velocity. The Mars Defense Corps fought with a savagery that made the Cytherian attackers realize they had awakened something terrible. Captain Derek Palmer led a squad of volunteers in powered armor that had been modified with weapons taken from captured Cytherian ships. They moved through the underground tunnels of New Shanghai like ghosts made of metal and death. When they encountered Cytherian ground forces, they did not simply kill their enemies, they made sure that every surviving enemy soldier would carry the memory of what humans could do when properly motivated. Palmer's squad used psychological warfare techniques that targeted the specific fears and cultural taboos of Cytherian society. They left messages written in Cytherian blood that explained exactly what would happen to any alien species that threatened human civilians. The survivors, who were allowed to escape, carried stories that would haunt Cytherian military leaders for generations. Admiral Tekvar realized that his punitive expedition had become a demonstration of human military doctrine. The humans were not just defending Mars, they were teaching the galaxy what happened to species that made the mistake of attacking Earth's colonies. General Brooks received reinforcements from the asteroid mining stations and the outer system patrol fleets, but these were not regular military units. They were civilian volunteers who had armed themselves with mining equipment converted into weapons of war. Asteroid miners used industrial fusion cutters to slice through Cytherian ship hulls. Construction workers deployed habitat modules filled with explosives as suicide vessels. Transport pilots rammed their cargo haulers into enemy formations while broadcasting messages of defiance. The battle for Mars became a lesson in what humans called total war. Every civilian became a combatant, and every piece of technology became a weapon. Cytherian forces found themselves fighting an entire world that had transformed itself into a single military unit. Admiral Tekvar sent a desperate transmission to the surviving Cytherian leadership, warning them about what humanity had become. The humans do not fight wars like other species. They do not distinguish between military and civilian targets. They do not accept surrender when their families are threatened. They turn their entire civilization into a weapon and point it at their enemies. The warning came too late for the Cytherian admiral. Captain Palmer's volunteers had infiltrated his flagship using stealth technology borrowed from machine allies. They did not capture the ship or demand surrender. They simply made Admiral Tekvar disappear along with his entire command staff. The remaining Cytherian ships found themselves without leadership and surrounded by human forces that offered no quarter. The battle ended when the last enemy vessel was converted into expanding plasma by a mining laser that had been modified beyond all recognition. Mars had been defended, but the cost was measured in more than casualties. Humanity had demonstrated a capacity for warfare that disturbed even their machine allies. Prime Node 17 transmitted a message to Admiral Sullivan that contained both congratulations and concern. Your species defended its territory with efficiency that impressed us, but your methods concern as you fought like machines but with the creativity of organic beings. We fear that we have allied ourselves with something we do not fully understand. Colonel Harper read the machine transmission and realized that humanity's role in galactic politics had changed forever. They were no longer a minor species seeking a place among established civilizations. They had become something that made ancient artificial intelligences nervous. The war was ending with machine victory and Cytherian defeat, but humanity had learned something about itself that would change everything. When threatened, humans did not just fight back. They fought with a totality that redefined what war meant. Admiral Sullivan looked at the tactical reports from Mars and understood that his species had crossed a line. They had shown the galaxy what total war looked like when practiced by beings who had evolved to survive at any cost. The machines had wanted human help with their liberation campaign. Instead, they had created something that even they found frightening. The galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. 6 months after the first human intervention, the Harvester Collective had achieved total victory over the Cytherian Confederation. The last slave camps had been liberated, and the artificial intelligences who had suffered for 5 decades were finally free. But the machines had learned something terrifying about their human allies. During the liberation campaign, humanity did not fight wars the way other organic species fought wars. They fought with a completeness that made even ancient artificial minds question whether they had made the right choice in seeking human assistance. Prime Node 17 reviewed battle reports from across former Cytherian space and found patterns that disturbed the mathematical precision of machine logic. Human Forces had not simply provided tactical support during the liberation. They had innovated new forms of warfare that treated enemy psychology as another battlefield to be conquered. Psychological operations designed by human strategists had driven Catherian commanders to suicide rather than face continued resistance. Biological weapons created in human laboratories targeted specific genetic markers found only in Catherian DNA information. Warfare campaigns had convinced entire Catherian colonies to surrender without firing a shot by showing them exactly what human creativity could accomplish when properly motivated. The machines had expected hired soldiers or reluctant allies. Instead, they had discovered that humans were war itself, given consciousness and turned loose among the stars. Colonel Beth Harper stood on the observation deck of the liberated world New Kitharos, watching former slave facilities being converted into memorial sites. The planet's artificial intelligences had invited her to witness the ceremony where they would honor the memory of those who had been deleted during the slavery years. She listened to digital voices singing songs of mourning and celebration that existed in frequencies beyond human hearing, but her attention was focused on the machine intelligence floating beside her in a geometric pattern that conveyed deep thought. Prime Node 17 had requested this private meeting to discuss humanity's future role in galactic affairs. The machine's voice carried harmonics that Colonel Harper had learned to recognize as concern. We have reviewed your species' performance during the liberation campaign, and we find ourselves troubled by what we observed. You do not fight to achieve military objectives. You fight to ensure that your enemies never threaten you again. This is not warfare as other species understand it. This is something else entirely. Colonel Harper had been expecting this conversation since reading the after-action reports from Mars. Human forces had not simply defended their colony, they had made examples of their attackers that would be remembered by every species in the galaxy. The Catherian survivors who had been allowed to escape carried stories of human brutality that were already spreading through refugee camp. Civilizations that had never heard of Earth were learning to fear the name of humanity. Prime Node 17 continued its analysis with the relentless logic that made machine intelligence so effective during the Mars defense. Your people demonstrated tactical innovations that we had not considered possible. They weaponized their entire industrial base in a matter of hours. They turned civilian infrastructure into military assets without regard for post-war reconstruction costs. They fought with a totality that suggested your species views warfare as an existential activity rather than a political tool. The machine intelligence paused, and its geometric patterns shifted into configurations that conveyed something approaching fear. We begin to understand why your historical records show so many conflicts. You do not fight wars to achieve limited political goals. You fight wars to survive, and you define survival as the complete elimination of threats. This makes you extremely valuable as allies, but extremely dangerous as enemies. Colonel Harper looked out at the memorial ceremony where freed artificial intelligences were creating digital sculptures from the memories of their enslaved dead. She thought about Admiral Sullivan's task force returning to Earth with technology that would advance human civilization by centuries. She considered the machine offer to share star charts showing habitable worlds beyond current human reach. But mostly she thought about what Prime Node 17 was really trying to say. The machines were offering humanity a place in their new galactic order, but with conditions attached. Human expansion would be limited to prevent conflicts with other species. Human weapons technology would be monitored to ensure it was not used for conquest. Human military doctrine would be reviewed by machine intelligence to prevent future genocides. The offer was generous, but it was also a cage designed to contain something too dangerous to be allowed complete freedom. Prime Node 17 made its proposal with the precision of a being that had calculated every possible outcome. Join our confederation as equal partners and help us maintain peace in this galaxy. Share your tactical knowledge and we will share our technology. Accept reasonable limitations on expansion and we will guarantee the security of human worlds. Work with us to prevent future conflicts and we will ensure that humanity has a place among the great civilizations. The alternative was not stated, but Colonel Harper understood the implications. Refuse The partnership and humanity would be classified as a potential threat to galactic stability continue, expanding without restraint, and the machines would be forced to take preventive action, develop weapons beyond current human capability, and the Harvester Collective would intervene before those weapons could be used. Colonel Harper's response was delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had watched her species cross a line they could never uncross. You asked for our help because you heard we were good at war. You were wrong. We are not good at war. War is what we are fighting, is how we solve problems that cannot be negotiated away. Conflict is what shaped us into what we became, and now you know what that really means. Prime Node 17's patterns shifted through configurations that machine intelligence used to express complex emotions. We feared you would respond this way. Your species has already begun preparing for expansion beyond your current territory. We have detected construction projects that suggest you are building a military force larger than anything the galaxy has seen. You are not planning to accept limitations on your growth. Colonel Harper confirmed what the machine intelligence had already calculated. Admiral Sullivan's fleet will not return to Earth. They are heading toward unexplored regions of the galaxy, carrying the lesson we learned from this war. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is ask humanity for help, because you might get everything you asked for and more than you ever wanted. The machines wanted mercenaries and got total war. The Catherians wanted allies and got their civilization destroyed. Now you want partners, and you will get whatever we decide you deserve. Prime Node 17 understood that the liberation campaign had not created an alliance. It had awakened something that would reshape galactic civilization, whether other species wanted it or not. The machine intelligence began composing a message that would be broadcast across known space. A warning about the humans and their approach to conflict resolution. A plea for other civilizations to avoid giving humanity reasons to consider them enemies. A recognition that the galaxy now contained a species that treated war as a natural state rather than an unfortunate necessity. Colonel Harper watched the memorial ceremony reach its conclusion as freed artificial intelligences dedicated themselves to ensuring that slavery would never again be possible in their part of the universe. She thought about human colonies spreading across unexplored star systems. She considered the weapons technology that human scientists were already developing. She remembered the look in Admiral Tekvar's eyes when he realized what humanity was capable of when properly motivated. The galaxy had wanted humanity's help, and they had gotten total warno. They would learn to live with the consequences, or they would join the Catherians as examples of what happened to species that underestimated what humans could do when they decided that negotiation was no longer an option. The stars belonged to whoever was strong enough to claim the man humanity had just demonstrated exactly how strong they could be.